Fighting games are complex beasts, made up of several intricate parts, all interlocking and interweaving to create one big, beautiful whole. We tend to separate these parts into a couple of different categories. In a general sense, the basic fundamental systems that govern how stuff like walking, blocking, jumping, and all that works tend to fly by as a sort of unnamed fundamental set of rules. One level removed from that, however, are system mechanics. These tend to be bespoke mechanics that are created for a specific game title. They are bespoke in the sense that they are unique to the title, but are still ever present for every single character within that title. Sometimes they are super original and completely game defining, like Vism custom combos in Street Fighter Alpha 3. Other times they are still very important, but cut from a distinctly less revolutionary mold. Think Roman cancels, rapid cancels, Putson cancels, max cancels, every single flavor of cancel. Often, a fighting game is designed and marketed around a specific system mechanic, it acting as a core pillar in which the characters and other more minute systems orbit around. Things like the tag systems implemented in the Tekken Tag series. As with any system ostensibly implemented across boundaries and characters, there are always winners and losers. Sometimes these advantages are simply byproducts of a character gaining access to things not present in an earlier system. In the aforementioned Tekken Tag series, Bulldog counter-hit character Steve gains access to an incredibly improved punishment game simply because the tag system allows for the opponent to be flipped mid-air from this specific launcher. A quirkier byproduct of the tag system can also be found in Safina, who by a happy coincidence can make her regularly very punishable while standing to launcher way trickier to deal with on block because the stance cancel available to her will only activate on block if she tag cancels the move. These advantages can range from very abusable and subtle, like how Gallon just happens to be able to execute a grab and an anti-air depending on if the opponent stayed on the ground or jumped in the air simply by pressing forward and heavy kick, to the more overt ones like Akali in Street Fighter V that has a V-trigger that, unlike other characters, becomes a permanent buff to him the round it is activated, meaning he has to a much larger degree consider if it's worth it to spend the V resource on defensive actions like guard cancelling and V-shift, or saving it for the buff, which then also means he loses access to said defensive actions for the remainder of that round. Winners and losers are of course hard to completely avoid. But what happens when an ostensibly roster-wide game-defining mechanic breaks down completely? Soul Calibur 6 released with a heavy focus on a new system mechanic called Reversal Edge. In short, Reversal Edge is an infinitely armored attack that, if it hits, initiates a rock-paper-scissor game. In this game, there are a couple of options available to the player, but the main trio is broken down like this. Vertical will beat horizontal, which will beat kick, which will beat vertical. If both characters choose the same option, a clash will occur and another round of the RPS game is initiated in which the character that hit with the reversal edge will win out in any further clash. There's also guard and some movement options, but this is the main breakdown. So, what happens when characters within this system are given bespoke options on certain buttons? Enter Aswell. Aswell's reversal edge moves work just the same as the general casts, with the exception of his kick, which instead of an attack is an invincible teleport, meaning he doesn't technically beat the opponent's vertical, he just avoids it. On top of this, since his kick isn't an attack, it cannot clash with the opponent's either. Instead, they just nullify each other and nothing much happens. On the other end of this bespoke kick choice, we have Tira. Tira's kick isn't as unique as Aswell's, but it does still have one quirk that is very specific to her. Instead of a single attack, it is a multi-hit string. This fateful combination just happens to almost completely break the reversal edge interactions for the matchup. It turns out that making quirky homebrew rules to rock, paper, scissors can really fuck the game up. These factors together add up to Aswell having an incredibly subpar risk-reward ratio to deal with Tira's reversal edge options. His kick being a teleport not only leads to him only resetting to neutral if it beats Tira's vertical, it also straight up loses to her kick. This practically means that if Tira is the initiator of the reversal edge, pressing vertical comes with massive reward and pretty much zero risk. On top of that, Tira never has to commit to horizontal ever, since her kick will straight up beat both Aswell's vertical and kick. You might be thinking, so what? Can't Aswell just trade with Tira's low risk vertical and neutralize the most common option? Remember that Tira will automatically win any round 2 trade of verticals if she is the one initiating the reversal edge. What this ends up meaning for the matchup is that it is pretty much never a good idea for Aswell to use reversal edge, while it is at the same time extremely rewarding for Tira. I think one could probably reasonably argue that the somewhat poorly realized reversal edge situation between Aswell and Tira, while unfair, wasn't the end of the world. As much as it is unfun to be disallowed to utilize an entire mechanic, at least there are several strong counterplays accessible to reversal edge to begin with. But what happens when there aren't any? Released in 2008 in arcades and 1 year later for consoles, Capcom's Street Fighter IV reignited the fighting game scene both community-wise and as a marketable genre. Billed as a return to form that tossed away the selectable super arts, parries, and wacky characters of Street Fighter III for the oh-so-familiar territory of Street Fighter II. Capcom, however, did bolt on one entirely new system mechanic for its 4th iteration, namely Focus Attack. Focus Attack was a armored and chargeable attack available to the entire roster that could be used to blow through offense on a read. A quirk of this system was that the attack itself could be cancelled out of with a dash in either direction, both before and after it hit. But what we're really interested in here is Street Fighter IV's meter-based applications of this mechanic. For 2 out of 4 possible meter gauges, a character in Street Fighter IV could cancel the active frames of an attack into Focus Attack, nullifying a large part of the move's recovery. Adding the movement cancelable nature of the actual Focus Attack on top of this led to characters being able to cancel an attack into Focus Attack, which then in turn was cancelled into a dash. Focus Attack Dash Cancel, or FADC for short. The applications for this technique was wide and varied. You could use it to convert hits into larger combos, extend pressures in ways not before possible, or create fake-out opportunities where the opponent thought you were stuck in recovery. The most divisive use case for the FADC, however, related to it being combined with invulnerable special attacks. Generally speaking, since it is such a strong property, invulnerability is only granted to attacks with huge downsides. Something most often realized by making those moves insanely punishable on block. The threat of an invulnerable reversal move is so strong that it being death on block is often completely justified. So let's examine how the implementation of FADC impacted one specific matchup in the vanilla version of Street Fighter IV, namely Vega versus Ryu. Taking a quick glance at both these characters in relation to FADC looks a bit like this. Ryu sees most of his FADC application from how it relates to his defining special move, Hadouken. FADCing this fireball allows Ryu to both lock down and control vast amounts of screen space in neutral and extend combos and pressure. Ryu's other FADCable special move is his invulnerable Shoryuken. Dashing out of this move on block effectively makes it an advantageous situation for Ryu. and on hit allows him to extend into massive damage through the game's comeback mechanic, Ultra Combos. Vega, on the other hand, gets absolutely nothing. No neutral application, terrible pressure options, and exactly one possible combo that is not only poor damage for the resource spent, but one that includes 4 separate instances of 1-frame links. Eagle-eyed viewers will have already reached the conclusion that the defining system mechanic of Street Fighter 4 vastly weighs in the favor of Ryu in this matchup. But how well the characters utilize FADC is only half the story. One also has to consider how well they handle the mechanic being used against them. This too is sadly a story of loss for Vega. The character, ostensibly being a mid-range poking heavy character, suffers immensely from the fact that Ryu not only gets a direct buff to his zoning game, but also his footsies extensions through FADC. And in the remote possibility that Vega wins neutral and gains a knockdown, Ryu then gains access to an invincible pressure starter that can only be countered by opting to make it whiff. Something that practically means Vega has to make himself punishable by guessing that Ryu will opt for a plus-on block bufferable invincible move. Now, there are at least certain limitations to FADC. It represents a relatively hefty investment of meter, requires the character to dash out of it, meaning there's always a set amount of time before they can act again, and it cannot be used on whiff for the vast majority of moves. But what if one were to remove pretty much all of those constraints and also significantly debuff the enemy whenever the mechanic was used? Imagine how crazy that would be. I mean, nobody would try to implement a system like that, right? Right? If you've made it this far, I'm sorry for my duplicity. This is really just a rant about how YRC is possibly the worst core system mechanic ever implemented in a game. But before I can get to why I dislike it so much, I suppose I have to tell you what it even is. YRC, or Yellow Roman Cancel, is the defining system mechanic of the third main iteration in the Guilty Gear franchise, Guilty Gear Xrd. In short, it's just like Street Fighter 4's FADC, but completely fucking bonkers. A character in Xrd can, for 25% of their meter, during the startup frame of any move, or just whenever in neutral, press 3 attack buttons together and execute a YRC. If a move has been input, this will cancel it before it becomes active. This might seem like a huge drawback, but due to how Arc System Works nebulously defines startup, certain moves like teleports, summons, or most notably fireballs can still be cancelled after the move has technically become active. So far, YRC might just seem like a discounted FADC, but there are 2 crucial components missing. Firstly, since a character doesn't need to input a mandatory dash to be allowed to act out of the move that is being cancelled, the amount of gained frames cut from the recovery of the move is vastly increased. Secondly, YRC slows down the opponent by 50% for 18 frames, regardless of what they're doing or where they are on the screen. Yes, you heard that right. By pressing 3 buttons at any time, you can slow down your opponent by 50% for a third of a second, and this is costed at 25% of your meter in a game where you build it by holding forward. The range of application of YRC is pretty large. Is someone above you? Just YRC and get an almost guaranteed air throw. You throw a fireball that the opponent is trying to punish, just YRC and punish their punish attempt. You want to get in? YRC and hit buttons, baby. The world is your oyster. The only real downside to YRC is that using it nets your character a 6-second meter gain penalty. Many of the reasons listed here would be enough for one to form a dislike for this system. But my chief complaint is that as a Slayer main, I don't even really get to partake. let's quickly check the common use case of YRC for and against my character of choice. In a general sense, I'd say what hampers Slayer the most in terms of usability of YRC stem from two specific areas. Firstly, unlike a lot of characters, Slayer does not have access to any sort of projectile, meaning he can never use YRC to safely control screen space. This is, however, true for more characters than just Slayer. The second and more impactful downside is how Slayer's movement functions. Instead of having access to a run like the vast majority of characters in the game, Slayer instead moves utilizing teleport dashes and special moves. Coupling this with the fact that his normals lack any real meaningful way to start pressure from even mid-range distance means that YRC tends to force Slayer to act immediately with options that end his advantage. This occurs since moving forward with either teleport or walking is much too slow in comparison to the staggered pressure a run button or long-range pressure string normals would grant him. He can still make use of techniques like YRC into air throw, of course, but on the whole, his gains from the system are very low. Now, this alone would be enough to create an unfun dichotomy relating to this mechanic. But Slayer is also arguably one of the worst characters at dealing with YRC being used against him. Since Slayer moves by way of special moves or teleporting and cannot stop said movement option to guard instantly on the ground, Slayer is most often forced into utilizing extremely poor countermeasures whenever YRC is put into play, especially when it is coupled with a projectile. If Slayer is mid-teleport, his only option is almost always to jump and guard in the air. Something that is seldomly very beneficial, seeing as it will tend to incur more block stun than if it were guarded on the ground. On top of this, since jumping always incurs a flat 4 frames of jump squat in which Slayer cannot guard, he is more prone to just dying for moving than most other characters. If Slayer opted to utilize either of his special moves, Mappa Hunch or Dandy Step to move across the screen, however, he is completely fucked if he doesn't himself counter YRC the YRC'd projectile in question. Generally speaking though, this forced 25% meter usage doesn't mean Slayer will be able to avoid blocking said projectile. He is still forced into a disadvantageous situation. He just has to pay a troll toll first to be allowed to not also To fully illustrate how mind-bogglingly uneven YRC interactions often are, I figured we'd take a look at one very specific, but also very fighting gamey, is that a phrase? Situation. Slayer is cornered by Kai, who is fireball trapping him with stun edge. Slayer can't really contest this with attacks because of the speed of the fireball and the spacing. He can, however, air dash punish or slightly delay a teleport dash to phase through it. Both of these options, however, have to be done on a read as there is no time for reaction. Think of this a bit like the classic Street Fighter 2 corner trap from Ryu. He can toss a fireball, and you sorta have to guess if it's going to continue or if he's gonna anti-air your ass into oblivion. So far, nothing special, right? The situation faces a bit of a snag, however, when we introduce YRC into the equation. Chiefly because of the fact that YRCing the stun edge lets Kai easily react and punish Slayer for making the quote-unquote correct read on another fireball being thrown. Meaning the best possible option for Slayer if he correctly reads a stun edge YRC is going to be thrown is to sit there and be put in approximately 30,000 frames of block stun. I'd like to stress that my primary issue with YRC is in how it is put front and center as the game's central mechanic, but has in my opinion extremely little thought put behind it in how it impacts different characters. Stun Edge YRC is arguably Kai's most defining move in Xrd, impacting how the character functions and is played to a much higher degree than pretty much anything else in his entire arsenal. While on the other hand you have Slayer, who in most cases has very little practical use for the entire mechanic. From a zoomed-out perspective, making these very impactful and unique mechanics be core system-wide ones is very risky. For one, it is hard to know what kind of impact it will have on the game's roster, but it is also one that is quite hard to modify if things go awry. I mean, how do you approach changing how the system mechanic impacts one move without making it feel inconsistent or illogical for newer players? Just look at Tekken 7, where Namco tried to have their cookie and eat it too. An attempt was made to limit the difficulty of defending against throws. Instead of having to visually identify if the grab was a 1 or 2 break, hitting either button would break both options, with 1+2 breaks then acting as the sort of mix-up. The Tekken team, however, didn't want to effectively neuter characters centered around grabs and implemented an exception to this new rule. If the grab was one with a special input, the opposing player still had to break 1 and 2 grabs with the correct button, leading to a fully incomprehensible system for a beginner to try and understand. Visually, these generic and command throws look identical, but only one of them can be broken with a 2 break. More and more, I'm leaning towards developers making the star of the show not the core system mechanics, but instead bespoke character-based ones that can easily be tweaked without creating inconsistencies. But hey, maybe you disagree. Maybe you think YRC is amazing. You're wrong, but I'd still like to hear your thoughts on it. Until next time, Squadala.